and welcome to The Banker's Top 1000 World Banks ranking for 2023. My name is John Everington. I'm the Africa and Middle East editor for The Banker, and we're going to be looking at the findings for the continent of Africa. But first of all, I'm joined by our editor, Joy McKnight, who's going to talk about the top-level findings. So, Joy, what's the big story this year?
Well, it's very interesting. What we've seen is a small contraction across the top 1,000 in the three main metrics that we look at. Obviously, the top 1,000 itself is ranked by Tier 1 capital, but we also look at total assets and pre-tax profits. What we've seen is a slight slowdown, so a 2% drop in Tier 1 capital, about a 1.5% drop in total assets, and then also a 6.5% drop in pre-tax profits, which is a huge turnaround from last year where we saw like about a 50% increase in pre-tax profits.
And this was following on from the coronavirus pandemic, wasn't it? The recovery, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, you look at it at first glance, you think, oh, the banks didn't do so well. But in actual fact, there is a main reason behind that, which is the strong US dollar. So because of the hikes in interest rates by the Federal Reserve, we saw the dollar appreciate by 12% against the pound, the British pound, about 9% against the Chinese yuan, and about 7% against the euro. So all the main currencies, the dollar appreciated against. So that meant that it sort of looks a bit worse than it is. But I think that what we've seen is like the assets, deposits, and loans, they're all very stable. Banks are very well capitalized, and they're really preparing for what's to come. The other big finding is who's at the top of the ranking, which is the Chinese banks yet again, led by ICBC. And again, in the totality of the ranking, if you had denominated the ranking in yuan, in actual fact, the Chinese banking sector would have grown by about 8%. Mm-hmm. But again, because of the strong effect of the US dollar, meant that it looked like it actually fell and contracted by, I think, about 1%. But anyway, so I think that's the interesting thing. But the ICBC is still on top, 4 Chinese banks still at the top of the ranking, and they're still growing, but maybe not at the double-digit growth that we've seen in previous years. Mm-hmm. But now let's talk a little bit about Africa. Obviously, the strong dollar might have had a big impact there. Is that correct?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, hearing what you were saying earlier, it's very much the same picture throughout much of Africa, not all of Africa, as we're going to hear about. But yes, particularly in the largest markets there, you've seen the dollar really strengthening and the sort of currencies weakening. And you've had a number of the big banks of the continent who've actually produced positive results in terms of their local currencies. But then when you do the dollar conversion, you inevitably have a kind of an impact on that top line. So that's really affected lenders throughout the continent, basically.
Okay, what about the big banking markets such as South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt? You know, how has that played out in those markets?
Indeed. I mean, South Africa is a sort of a case in point. So you've got the big 4 there, led by Standard Bank Group, which is still the largest bank in Africa this year. All 4 of those banks, they kind of produce positive results in terms of their asset growth, in terms of their Tier 1 capital growth, and in terms of their profits. But then, because the rand weakened significantly, and I mean particularly significantly for some banks, you have different reporting cycles there. You really saw that on the top line numbers. Egypt is a story that we've been tracking quite closely the past couple of years, really, in particular. You've seen severe currency depreciations there because of their economic crisis. Those started to feed in towards the end of 2022 and have, of course, developed into 2023 as well. So that's really hit banks' top lines in terms of their Tier 1 and their assets. You really have seen a reduction in those banks that have reported. We don't have all the Egyptian banks in because some of them didn't provide full data sets for the end of the year by the time our data had to be compiled. But those that have reported that data have seen significant falls because of that currency depreciation. And then also just in Nigeria, you do have a little bit of a depreciation of the naira going throughout 2022. The big picture story there, particularly for the larger banks, is their exposure to Ghanaian euro bonds. In Ghana, towards the end of last year, the government warned that there needed to be haircuts for people who held that debt. And so this really impacted the 2 largest banks in particular, Zenith Bank and Access Bank. They saw their Tier 1 capital position fall down for the year thanks to that Ghanaian exposure. when you look at lower down UBA, United Bank for Africa, they're in Ghana as well, but they're a much smaller player there, much smaller holders of debt. So they actually had a much more successful year than the big boys because of that sort of lower exposure. So a mixed picture within Nigeria.
Okay, so looking beyond sort of some of the bad news, who were the highest performers in Africa?
I think the one that stands out, I mean, ironically, when you look at the sort of rankings, it's an Egypt bank, it's a Afrexim bank. And a Afrexim bank is an MFI, which was founded by the African Development Bank. It went on a capital raising spree towards the end of 2021, and that really played out into 2022. They raised about 1.3 billion, I think it was, during that year in dollars. So they are the sort of the biggest sort of like kind of they're the sort of standout in terms of the rises within Africa for 2022. And the other sort of excuse me, the other country to mention is Angola. Angola's Kwanza, their currency there, is one of the few currencies within Africa which actually strengthened against the dollar during the year because of higher oil exports, particularly in the first half of the year. So you actually have the country's three largest banks there all increasing their Tier 1 capital position as a result and entering the top 25 for the year.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your insights, John.
Thank you, Joy.
And you can read all the African results, including best performing banks in Nigeria and South Africa, on thebanker.com/top1000.